Josephine Hartley branded her 1,000th calf as the sun came up red over the Kansas grass. The girl who once darned her own stockings by a candle stub now signed cattle contracts bigger than the bank in town could cover. 10,000 head wore her mark, and in 10 long years, she never once wrote to ask him why he left. Then, on a gray morning, Elias Ward rode back into Harlan's Crossing, hat in his hand. Empty in the pockets. 40 cowhands watched him stop a passing rider and ask where the Hartley place might be. The rider laughed. "You mean the Half Moon? Son, half this county belongs to that woman." And when Elias reached her gate, she looked down at him from her horse and said, dry as August dust, "You left a girl with empty pockets, Elias. You'll find she filled them herself." There was a strong box in her dead father's study, locked, 11 letters inside it, never delivered. She had never once had the heart to open it. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. Before we ride out onto those plains together, do this one small thing. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one, and I like to know where in the world these stories find you. Now let's begin. Josephine Hartley was 17 years old when Elias Ward kissed her behind her father's failing barn and swore he'd come back with money enough to marry her. It was a spring night, the kind that smells of wet earth and green shoots. He was 26, lean already, with rope burns on his palms and a look in his eye like the horizon was calling his name out loud. He held her face in both hands. He told her the ranches out west paid top wages to a man who could ride and rope and hold a herd through a hard night. He told her he'd send for her. He told her to wait. She waited. He rode out the next morning on a borrowed horse, and the dust closed up the road behind him like a door. The letters never came. That was the fact she built the rest of her life on. No letters. No word. No money. And no man. A silence so complete that after a while she stopped listening for hoofbeats on the county road. Her father, Amos, told her a drifter was a drifter, and a girl was a fool to hang her whole heart on a saddle bum with holes in his boots. She had wanted to slap him for it. Instead, she went quiet, the way you go quiet when someone says a thing you're afraid is true. Then the hard years came, one on top of the other. The wheat failed. The cattle came down sick. Amos mortgaged the quarter section to keep it, then mortgaged it again, and the interest ate him the way a slow fever eats a strong man. He died in the fall she turned 24. He died owing money to 3 men and an apology to 1, though she wouldn't understand that last part for another 10 years. She buried him under the lone cottonwood on the ridge. Then, she wiped her face, walked into the bank in Harlan's Crossing, and told the loan officer she'd pay every dollar her father owed, and she'd need a little more besides. The man laughed at her. She remembered that laugh a long time. She did not laugh back. She just made him wrong. She took the debt-choked quarter section and she turned it into the Half Moon. She learned the price of beef in Kansas City and the price of beef in Chicago and the difference between the two, which is where a fortune hides. She learned which grass fattened a steer and which only filled its belly. She learned to read a sky, a note, a man's face across a table. She bought the neighbor's failing spread when he gave up, and the one past that. She drove her own herds to the railhead. She stood in the sale yard in a plain wool dress among men in good coats, and she outbid every one of them, and she paid in full, and she never once let them see her hands shake. By the time she was 34, the Half Moon ran 10,000 head across land you couldn't cross in a day's hard ride. The river bottom was hers, and the water rights that came with it, which mattered more than the grass and more than the cattle, though few men understood that yet. The brand was known from Dodge to Kansas City. When Josephine Hartley walked into the bank now, the loan officer stood up. She had built all of it herself. That was the thing she held onto in the cold hours. Not a husband, not a father's help. Herself, there was only one thing on the whole place she had not touched. In the corner of her father's old study, under the window, sat a black iron strongbox with a heavy lock. Amos had kept his papers in it. Deeds, notes, the small mean secrets of a man who'd owed too much for too long. After the funeral, she'd meant to open it. She'd carried the key to it 100 times. And 100 times she'd set the key back down. She told herself there was time. She told herself there was nothing in it she needed. The truth, if she'd said it aloud, was simpler and softer than that. She could not bear to sit among her father's things and feel him gone all over again. So the box stayed locked. 10 years, locked, she dusted around it and never opened it, and she'd have told you it held nothing but old paper. That was the half moon in the spring Elias Ward came home. The morning he rode in, the crew was cutting the fall gather ahead of schedule, and the whole crossing had its business out on the street. So there were plenty to see it. He came from the west, the way he'd gone. A lean man on a leaner horse, a good saddle, worn pale at the horn, and a bedroll behind it that was near the whole of what he owned. 36 now. Gray coming in at the temples under the trail dust. His hands were a working man's hands, cracked and sure, and he sat the horse the way a man sits who has spent more nights in the saddle than in a bed. But his pockets were empty. Anyone could see that. In a town that measured men by what they had, Elias Ward had come back with nothing but himself. He reined up in front of the mercantile and asked a rider where the Hartley spread was. The rider looked him up and down. Took his time about it. "You mean the half moon?" he said. "Son, half this county belongs to that woman. Word ran ahead of him the way it does in a small place. By noon they knew. Joe Hartley's old sweetheart had come back. The one who'd left her with nothing, 10 years gone, and here he was riding up to her gate without so much as a second horse to his name." They stood on the boardwalk and watched him ride out the east road, and they grinned, and they laid odds. A penniless drifter, come courting the richest cattlewoman on the plains. It was the best joke Harlan's Crossing had had in a season. Joe heard he was coming before she saw him. A boy rode in from the crew to tell her, breathless, half laughing himself. She was on her gray mare at the north gate, going over the day's cut with her tally, and she did not so much as lift her head from the book. "Let him come," she said. But her hand had gone still on the page. She heard the horse first. Then she turned the mare and rode down to meet him at the main gate, because she would not have him ride up to her door. She would meet him on her own ground, on her own horse, with her own fence between them. He stopped on the far side of the gate. She stopped on the near. For a moment, neither of them said a word. 10 years sat down in the road between them and made itself comfortable. He'd aged. She saw that first. The gray, the deeper lines, the way the sun had worked at him. But the eyes were the same. That was the cruel part. The eyes were exactly the same, and they were looking at her the way they'd looked at her behind the barn, like she was the only fixed point in a moving world. "Josephine," he said. Just her name. Rough, like he hadn't said it aloud in a long time. Maybe he hadn't. "It's Miss Hartley to the men," she said. "You'd be one of the men, if you were anything. You're not." He took off his hat, held it against his chest. "I came back. I see that." She let her eyes go over him, slow, the way the rider on the street had. The worn saddle, the thin bedroll, the empty pockets. "You came back the same way you left. With nothing. Joe, you swore you'd come back with money enough to marry me." Her voice did not rise. That was the frightening thing about her, and she knew it, and she used it. 10 years. Elias, you left a girl with empty pockets. She gathered the reins. You'll find she filled them herself. And she turned the mare and rode back up the rise to her house, and she did not look behind her, not once, though every step of the way she felt his eyes on her back like a hand. She did not fall into his arms. She had promised herself that in the road 100 times before he ever came, and she kept the promise. But she did not tell the gate man to turn him off, either. She noticed that about herself later, and it troubled her. He camped that night just outside her fence line, on the county road, where he had every right to camp and she had no cause to move him. She saw the small fire from her upstairs window. She stood there in the dark a long time, watching it burn down, and told herself it was only that she was a careful woman, watching a stranger near her stock. In the morning he rode up to the crew and asked the foreman for a day's work. Now, the half-moon was short-handed. That was plain fact, and it galled her that it was true just then. The fall gather was on, 2 of her men were laid up, and a rider had quit over wages the week before. She needed hands. And here was a man who, whatever else he was, could clearly ride and rope and had done it his whole life. Her foreman came up to the house to ask her. Awkward about it. Turning his hat. He's asking day wages, Miss Hartley. Nothing more. Says he'll work the gather and move on. She stood on the porch a long moment. Pride said turn him off and let the county have its laugh at his expense instead of hers. But she had not built the half-moon on pride. She'd built it on beef and grass and hard sums, and the sums just then said she needed a hand. Day wages, she said. Same as any man. He sleeps at the bunkhouse or on the road, his choice, and he takes no favors. And Tom, she stopped the foreman as he turned. He calls me Miss Hartley. Same as any man. Yes, ma'am. So Elias Ward went to work for the woman he'd come to marry, for $1 a day, and neither of them said one word about the past while the sun was up. He was better than any hand she had. She saw that within the hour, and it made her angrier than it should have. There was a windmill on the North Range that had been dead for 3 years. It fed the only water on that whole dry stretch, and when it quit, that grass had gone to waste because you couldn't run cattle where there was nothing to drink. She'd had 3 men look at it. 2 said the gearing was cracked past fixing, and she'd need a whole new mill freighted out from Kansas City, which would cost her the earth and take a season. The 3rd just shook his head and quoted her the same. She'd let it sit, a standing monument to money she didn't want to spend, and moved her cattle around it. The second morning, Elias rode out to it on his own time, before the crew was even horsed. She watched him from the ridge through the field glasses her father had left her. He climbed the tower. He was up there a long while in the wind, doing something with the gearing she couldn't make out. Then he came down, and he worked at the base a while, and he freighted water up in a canvas bag, and he did whatever it was a man does who understands the machine, and not just the money it costs. By afternoon the blades were turning. By evening the tank was filling, and the good north grass had water on it for the first time in 3 years. He never said a word about it, just came in with the crew at dusk, dusty and quiet, and took his plate at the far end of the hands table. Tom the foreman told her, though, couldn't help himself. That north mill's running, Miss Hartley. Ward fixed her, said the gearing just wanted the crack packed and reset, and a part off an old harrow that was sitting in your barn. Cost you nothing. 3 men said that mill was dead. I heard you, she said. She went out that evening after the men had eaten, on the excuse of walking her house, and she stood in her father's old study a moment with a lamp. And there on the mantel, where it had sat for 19 years, was a small carved horse. A cottonwood colt. Whittled rough by a boy's knife, the legs too thin, the head a little large, the mane suggested with 3 clumsy strokes. Elias had carved it for her the summer she was 15, sitting on the barn's shady side while she shelled peas. She had kept it through every hard year, through the funeral, through the debt, through every move and every winter. It had sat on that mantel while she forgot on purpose the hands that made it. He'd seen it. She was sure of that now. He'd been in the house that first day to sign the daybook, and the study door had stood open, and a man's eye finds the one thing in a room that belongs to him. Neither of them had said a word about it. She put the lamp down and looked at the little horse a long time. Then she blew out the light and went up to bed, and she did not send him off in the morning, and that was the first thin crack of ice, though she'd have died before she called it that. The trouble that had been coming for the Half Moon arrived 4 days later, in a good black coat, in a hired buggy, with a leather case on the seat beside him. His name was Harmon Sloan. He was the agent for the Continental Cattle and Land Company, and he came to the door smiling. Joe received him on the porch and did not ask him in. She'd met his kind before. Smooth men with company money, who spoke of progress and meant profit, and who looked at a river the way a wolf looks at a full pen. Miss Hartley. He took off his hat. His teeth were very white. I represent the Continental. Perhaps you've heard the railroad's putting a spur through this county. I've heard talk. It's more than talk now. And a spur needs water for the yards and the engines. Your river bottom is the natural place for it. He opened his case with the ease of a man who's done this 100 times. Now, I'll come to the point, because I hear you're a woman who likes it plain. The Continental has bought your expansion note. The $8,000 your operation carries against the wells and the river claim. He drew out a paper. We hold it now. Not the bank. She did not let her face change. But something in her went cold and still, the way it had gone when the loan officer laughed at her 10 years before. That note isn't due for 3 years, she said. The note has a call provision, Miss Hartley. You may not have read it as close as your late father did. The smile stayed put. We're calling it 60 days. $8,000. In full. He let that sit. Then he softened, which was worse. Or, you sell the Continental your water rights on the river bottom, for the spur. A fair price. We tear up the note. You keep your grass, your cattle, your fine ranch. You lose nothing but a claim on water you hardly use. I use every drop of it, she said. And I'll use it long after your spur's rusted. 60 days is a short time to raise $8,000, ma'am. Even for you. He put the paper away, unhurried. I'll leave you to think on it. These things always look different when the date comes near. He put his hat on and went down the steps to his buggy, and Elias was there at the yard fence, having come in with a lame horse, and Sloan paused by him. Looked him over the way the whole county had learned to look him over. New hired man? Sloan said pleasantly, gathering his lines. She goes through them. And he touched his hat brim and drove off down the east road in the dust. Elias stood at the fence a long moment. Then he turned and went back to the lame horse and said nothing, and Joe, on her porch, understood 2 things at once. That her whole fortune was suddenly balanced on 60 days, and that the man at her fence had just been told, to his face, exactly what the county thought he was. She should have felt only the first thing. She was troubled to find she felt the second. The cattleman's supper came at the end of that week. It was held every fall at the big hall in Harlan's Crossing, and every rancher and banker and landman for 40 miles came, with their wives in their good dresses, and there was beef and there was talk of prices, and it was where the county measured itself against itself. Joe went every year. She had to. A woman who ran 10,000 head could not hide from the men she did business with, and she'd learned long ago that the way to sit among them was to sit as their equal and dare them to say otherwise. She wore a good dark dress and her mother's small gold earrings, the only soft thing she owned. She went alone, as she always did, because there was no man in the county she'd have on her arm, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise. But this year there was Gideon Rowe. Gideon was a decent man. That was the plain truth of him and the whole of him. He ranched east of her, a solid middling spread, and he sat on the bank's board, and he'd been quietly courting her for 2 years in a slow, patient, dutiful way that never once put a foot wrong. He offered her security. He offered her a name and a settled life, and a man who would never leave, never fail, never once give her a night's worry. When he crossed the hall to her that evening and offered his arm to walk her in to supper, it was gracious, and it was proper, and half the room softened to see it. Gideon Rowe and Joe Hartley. The safe match. The sensible one. You could see the county nodding, and at the far end of the hall, at the long table where the hired hands ate, sat Elias Ward. He'd come in with the Half Moon crew, because that's what he was now, a hand, and hands ate at the hands table. He wore his one clean shirt. He'd shaved. He sat straight, and he ate quiet, and he did not once look toward the head of the room where she sat by Gideon Rowe in the lamplight. But the county looked. Oh, they looked. They had the whole picture in front of them now, laid out plain on 2 tables. The richest woman on the plains, in gold earrings, at the high table, on the arm of the decent banker who'd marry her. And down at the low table, in a borrowed chair, the penniless drifter who'd sworn to marry her and come back with nothing. You could feel it move through the room. The glances, the women leaning to each other behind their hands. The soft ripple of a laugh, quickly hushed, that was worse than a loud one. She sat through it with her spine straight and her face still, and she felt every whisper land on her like a fleck of ash. She heard one woman say penniless. She heard another say 10 years and shameless. She heard, or thought she heard, poor Joe, and that one went in deepest, because in all the county's judging she was the fool in the story. The woman who'd built an empire and still had her old heartbreak sitting at the servants' table for everyone to see. She was Josephine Hartley. She had outbid every man in this room at one time or another, and they had reduced her, in one evening, to a jilted girl. She could not bear it. When the supper broke up and the crew went out to the horses, she found Elias by the rail in the dark, cinching his saddle. "Draw your pay in the morning," she said, low and fast, so the words were out before she could weigh them. "The gather's near done. I don't need you past it. Draw your pay and ride on." He didn't turn around right away. When he did, his face in the spill of lamplight from the hall was not hurt. That was the thing she'd remember. It was only tired, and it was kind, and it made everything worse. "All right, Joe," he said. "Quiet. All right." He didn't argue. He didn't remind her of the windmill or the 10 years or the little horse on her mantle. He just said all right, like a man who'd been expecting it, like a man who thought this was no more than he had coming. And that was the worst of all, that he'd take her cruelty as if it were only justice. She rode home alone in the dark, furious at the county and furious at him, and most of all furious at herself, and she could not have told you which of the 3 was the true target. He'd have been gone by noon the next day. He was not gone. Because of the stallion. She'd bought the horse 2 years back, a big black stud out of good blood, meaning to improve her saddle stock. But something in him had been broken by a bad hand before her, and he could not be gentled. He'd put 2 of her men in bed and killed a 3rd's horse under him. She'd penned him alone in the far corral, this black devil of a horse she'd named Ember for the red flare in his eye, and she'd decided, the week before, that she'd have to shoot him, because a killing horse is no good to any man and a danger to all of them. That morning, the morning Elias was to leave, Ember went through the corral rails. Something spooked him at first light. He hit the top rail full at a run, and it broke, and then he was out and loose in the main yard with the crew's saddle horses, screaming, striking, 1,000 pounds of black fury with men scattering before him. He caught a rail and flung it. He came around on a young hand, and the boy went over the fence just ahead of the hooves. It was a bad few seconds. It was about to be a very bad morning. Joe was on the porch. She saw it start, and she was already turning for the rifle inside the door. Because there was nothing else to do with a horse like that once he was loose and murderous, and her heart was up in her throat with the certainty that someone was about to be killed in her own yard. And then Elias stepped into the yard. He'd been at the corral saddling his own horse to leave. He set his hat down slow on a post. He didn't run, and he didn't shout. He walked out into the middle of that yard toward the maddened stallion, easy, his hands loose and low, and he started to talk. She couldn't hear the words. It was a low, steady sound, more hum than speech, the kind of sound a man makes who has spent a lifetime near frightened animals and knows that his own quiet is the only rope that will hold. The crew froze where they stood. Ember wheeled on him, ears flat, and struck the air. Elias didn't stop, didn't flinch. Kept coming, slow, sideways, never square on, that low sound running out of him unbroken. Jo stood in her doorway with the rifle in her hands and did not raise it. It took a long time. Long enough that her arms ached from holding the gun. The stallion charged twice, and both times pulled up short of the man, confused, because the man would not do what every other man had done, would not run, would not shout, would not give him a fight to answer. And little by little the red went out of the horse's eye. The ears came up. The great head dropped. And Elias Ward walked the last 3 steps and laid his open hand on the black neck, and the killer stood, sweating, blowing, and let himself be led back into the pen like a lamb. And Jo, watching, saw the boy she'd loved inside the man's hands. That was the phrase that came to her, standing in her doorway with the rifle gone heavy. She saw the boy. She saw 15-year-old Elias with a knife and a bit of cottonwood, patient, unhurried, coaxing a shape out of the raw wood the same way he'd just coaxed the fury out of that horse. It had been the thing she loved in him first. Not his looks, and not his promises, his hands, and the gentleness in them, and the way living things settled under them. She lowered the rifle. She set it inside the door. She walked down into the yard, past the shaken crew, and she stood at the pen while he came out and shut the gate, and for once she couldn't find the cold voice she used on him. "You were leaving," she said. "I was." "Don't." The word came out before she'd decided to say it. She heard it land. Saw his eyes come up. She made herself go on, made it sound like business, because she could not make it sound like the other thing. "The gather's not done. I'm still short a hand. I spoke too quick at the supper. That was the county's foolishness getting into me, and I'm not a woman who lets the county do her thinking." She looked at the horse instead of at him. "Stay on. Regular wages." Something moved in his face. He looked at the black stallion, quiet now, and then back at her. "Day wages," he said. "Same as I had. No more. That horse is worth $400 gentled, and you just made him worth it. A man who can do that is worth more than $1 a day, and you know it. Day wages." "Jo," he said again, gentle and immovable as he'd been with the horse. "That's all I'll take." She didn't understand it then. She thought it stubbornness or pride of a poor kind. She'd understand it later, and it would break something in her when she did. But that morning she only nodded, short, and went back up to the house, and she did not shoot the stallion, and she did not send the man away, and the county could make of that what it liked. He would not take a raise. That was the thing she came to understand about him over the weeks that followed, and it was the thing that told her, at last, who he'd become. She learned how the drifter of 10 years back had spent his 10 years. Trail boss now, top hand, a man other men followed on a hard drive. He'd made and lost more than one stake to bad luck and worse partners, and he'd come home at last with nothing but his skill, because that was the only thing that had never failed him. He could have named a foreman's wage anywhere in Kansas. He came to her for $1 a day and would not take a cent more, and she finally saw, one cold morning, exactly why. It was the money. Her money. He would not touch it. He would not be seen reaching for it. In a county that had already tried and convicted him as a fortune hunter come to marry a rich woman's ranch, he had decided he would give them no proof, not $1 worth, ever. He would work for her at the wage of the poorest hand she had, and he would let the whole crossing watch him do it. He would earn a place beside her with his hands, or he would not have one at all. She understood, and understanding it, she was caught between two feelings that would not lie down together. Because his shame was pulling him one way and his love another, and she could see both of them plain in him, and she could not tell him she saw. The audience of her own heart watched him refuse a raise and wanted to weep and could not say why. The night the heifers calved is when the ice broke enough to laugh through. A norther came down in the middle of the fall calving, weeks early and mean, and the young heifers on the near range began to drop their calves into the cold. A calf born wet into a freezing night dies fast if no one's there. Jo was there. She was always there for a hard night. The half-moon was hers down to the last newborn. And Elias was there, because he did not sleep when there was stock in trouble. The two of them worked that line most of the night, one lantern between them, going heifer to heifer in the dark and the wind. He'd pull a calf that was coming wrong, and she'd rub it with sacking to bring the blood up, and they'd get it to its feet and get it sucking, and move on to the next before the cold took it. Their hands touched a dozen times over the small hot bodies of newborn calves, and neither of them pulled back, because there was no time for it, and no room. And after a while, the not pulling back stopped being an accident. Near dawn they lost one and saved the mother, and then they got a big backward calf out of a first-time heifer that neither of them had thought would live, and the little thing came out steaming into the lantern light and shook its head and bawled, mad and alive, and Elias laughed. It was a short, surprised, tired laugh, and it broke out of him before he could stop it. And Jo laughed too. The first laugh between them in 10 years, over a newborn calf in the freezing dark, with the wind screaming and their hands both on the wet, steaming little body, and for one moment, the 10 years were not there at all. There was only the two of them, and the lantern, and the small, stubborn life they'd pulled into the world together. And something eased in her chest that had been clenched so long, she'd forgotten it was clenched. Then, the moment passed, the way they do, and they went back to work. But it had happened. She could not unhappen it. The drought was the next thing, and the drought was the thing that mattered to her whole fortune. The rains failed that fall. The range browned, and then browned worse, and the water holes shrank to cracked mud, and the fall drive to the railhead loomed over all of it like a debt coming due. Which in a way it was, because the beef in that drive was how she meant to raise the $8,000 Sloane's 60 days were counting down toward. Everything came together now. She had to move 10,000 head to the railhead across country that had no water on the old route, and if she lost condition on the drive, she lost the price. And if she lost the price, she lost the note. And if she lost the note, she lost the half-moon. The old drive route ran straight north. It always had. But straight north that year was dust. And every rancher in the county was looking at the same dry road and doing the same worried sum. Elias rode the country for 3 days before the drive. Alone, on his own time, reading the grass and the sky and the dry beds the way another man reads a page. And he came to her at the house at dusk on the 3rd day, and for once, he came right up onto the porch. Because this was business, and business was the one ground he'd stand on with her as an equal. "Your north route's dead," he said. "No water on it clear to the railhead. You push 10,000 head up that road, you'll walk the fat off them by the 2nd day and lose 1/10 of them to thirst. It's the only route there is. It's the only route men use." He crouched and drew in the dust of her porch with one finger, a line, a curve, a mark for water. "There's an old buffalo trace west of it, swings wide, adds 2 days. But it holds 3 live springs and a creek that's still running because it comes off the high ground. I rode every one of them. There's water the whole way if you go wide." He looked up at her. 2 days longer. But your beef gets to the railhead heavy instead of thin. That's the difference between making your note and not. She looked at the line in the dust a long time. He had just handed her the whole season. He didn't say it. She heard it anyway. A dry drive on the old route would have cost her the beef, and the beef was the note, and the note was everything. This man, who would not take $1 over a hired hand's wage, had just spent 3 days of his own time riding dry country to save the thing that was her entire fortune, and he'd have said nothing about it if she hadn't been standing there to hear it. "We go wide," she said. West route. Your route. And then, because she'd decided at that moment and could not have said exactly when the decision was made, she did the thing that could not be taken back. The drive gathered at dawn, the whole crew horsed, the herd bawling and swinging, 30 riders and more waiting on her word to string them north and west into the dry. And Joe Hartley rode out in front of all of them on her gray mare, and she raised her voice so the whole assembled crew could hear it, every hand and every neighbor's man who'd hired on for the drive, the whole county's eyes and ears. You'll take your orders on this drive from Elias Ward, she said. He's my trail foreman. His route, his word, same as mine. Elias, his first name, in front of the crew. In front of the county's men, who'd carry it back to the crossing before the dust settled. She said his first name out loud in the open and dared any man there to whisper. And no man did, because there was something in her face that morning that a wise man did not test. The ice cracked clean through, and everyone saw it crack. Elias sat his horse very still. Then he touched his hat to her, once, and turned to the crew, and began to give the orders that would move 10,000 head, and his voice was steady and sure, and the men answered it. Far off to the northwest, low on the edge of that dry, bright sky, a line of cloud was building that no one on that drive had time to watch. It sat on the horizon like a bruise, dark at the bottom, and it was early for such a thing. Weeks too early, and it was coming their way. But that morning they all had their eyes on the herd and their new foreman, and no one looked north, and the storm gathered where nobody was watching. The drive strung north in a long brown river of horn and hide, and for 3 days the storm sat where it was and did not come closer. Elias worked the point. He rode the drag when the drag needed a steady man. He rode the flanks in the heat of the afternoon when the cattle wanted to swing east toward the dry, and he turned them back with nothing but his voice and the flat of his hat. Joe watched him from her gray mare and said little. The crew had stopped watching by the second morning. A man who knew cattle was a man who knew cattle, and they had all seen that he did. The nights were the thing. They camped by whatever water the West Trace gave them, and the water was there, exactly where he'd said it would be. 3 live springs and a creek. The cook set his fire, and the men ate and rolled into their blankets, and the herd bedded down bawling, and then went quiet. And Joe found she could not sleep without a cup of coffee at that last fire, and Elias found he could not either, and so the two of them sat. They did not talk much at first. The fire talked for them. On the 4th night she said it. She hadn't meant to. You whittled me a colt once, she said. A little cottonwood colt. I was 16. Elias turned the tin cup in his hands. I remember. It's on my mantel. He was quiet a long moment. The fire popped and threw a spark that died before it reached the grass. I know, he said. I saw it. The first night. You never said. Wasn't mine to say. It's your mantel. She looked at him then, full on, the way she had not let herself look at him in 10 years. The years had cut him down. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, and there was gray coming in at his temple, same as hers. He was 36 years old, and he owned a saddle and a bedroll and the clothes he stood in, and he was the richest thing she had sat beside in a decade. And she could not have told a single soul in the county why. Why'd you keep it? He asked. She didn't answer that. Some questions you don't answer at a fire. She threw the last of her coffee into the dark and stood. Storm's holding, she said. Good, watch changes at midnight. But the storm was not holding. It was only waiting. Gideon Rowe rode out to the drive on the 5th day. He came alone on a good bay horse, in a good coat, a decent man doing a decent thing, and he found Joe at the noon halt and swung down and took off his hat. Gideon always took off his hat. 2 years he'd been coming to the half moon with his hat in his hand, and he'd never once pushed, and that was the trouble with Gideon. He never pushed. Josephine, he said. I wrote out because I won't say this in front of the county and I won't say it after the note comes due, because then it'll look like charity, and I've got too much respect for you to shame you with charity. Say it then, Gideon. He turned his hat in his hands. Marry me. The bank will carry your note if my name's beside it. You'll keep the half-moon, every acre, every head. You'll keep your brand. I'll not ask you to change one nail of it. He swallowed. I'm not a fool, Joe. I know you don't look at me the way a woman looks at a man she can't live without, but I'd be good to you. And you'd never lie awake over $8,000 again. It was a good offer. It was the best offer a woman in her position could ask for, and she knew it. And Gideon knew it. And the terrible thing was that it was kind. She looked past him. Elias was down the line, working a lame steer out of the herd, his back to them, and he did not turn around, and she understood he'd made himself not turn around. You're a good man, Gideon Rowe, she said. Better than I've been to you. That's not an answer. No, she said. It's not. Give me till the railhead. He put his hat back on. Till the railhead, he said. And he mounted, and he rode east, and he did not look back either, and there were 2 good men on that plain that day who would not let her see their faces, and she rode north between them, and felt like the loneliest rich woman in Kansas. The rider came on the 6th day, from the south, hard, his horse blown. He carried a letter from the bank in Harlan's Crossing, and Joe read it standing in her stirrups, and her face did not change. Which is how the crew knew it was bad. The auction was set. Continental had forced it. In 11 days, the half-moon would be sold on the courthouse steps unless the note was paid in full, and to pay the note in full she had to get 10,000 head to the railhead and sold, and the papers of her father's estate had to be cleared for the sale, every deed and every claim, and that meant the strong box. The lawyer needed the strong box opened. Everything in it. The court would not sell a thing until the dead man's papers were accounted for. She had carried the key for 3 years and never turned it. That night she sat by the fire with the little iron box on her knees. She'd had it fetched from the house on the wagon that carried the branding irons, and it had ridden north under a tarp, and now it sat cold in her lap with the key in the lock. Elias sat across the fire and did not ask what it was. My father's, she said. I never had the stomach. Then don't, he said. Tonight. The court needs it. The court can wait a night. But she turned the key. She had put it off 3 years, and she was done putting it off, and she was Joe Hartley, who did the hard thing at the hard time, because that was the only way anything got built, and she lifted the lid. The deeds were on top, tied in string. Under the deeds, the mortgage papers, and the old grief of them, her father's cramped hand, and under those, at the very bottom, flat against the iron, a bundle of letters tied with a bootlace. 11 of them. She did not understand at first. She thought they were her father's. Then she saw the hand on the front of them, and the hand was not her father's, and she knew it. She had known it once better than her own. She had watched it write her name behind a failing barn when she was 17 years old. Elias Ward. To Miss Josephine Hartley. The Hartley place, Harlan's Crossing. Every one of them. 11 never opened. The wax still whole. The seals never broke. She made a sound she had never made in front of anyone. Elias was around the fire before she knew he'd moved. He saw the letters in her hands, and he saw the hand on them, his own hand, 10 years younger, and the blood went out of his face. I wrote you, he said, very low. Joe, I wrote you. Every month, near, for 2 years. I wrote you from Abilene and from the nations and from Texas, and you never once wrote back, and I thought you'd made your peace with your father and put me out of your mind, and after 2 years a man stops writing into a well. They're sealed, she whispered. Elias, they're still sealed. He knelt down beside her in the firelight, and the two of them looked at the 11 letters. And the truth came up out of that iron box like cold water out of the ground. Amos Hartley had taken them. Amos, who thought a drifting cowhand with holes in his boots was no husband for the girl he was grooming to save the ranch by marrying money. Amos, who had met the mail rider at the road all those years and taken the letters with his son-in-law's hopes in them and locked them in his box and said nothing and died with them locked away, owing his daughter a truth and owing the man across the fire an apology he was 10 years too dead to give. "He never told me," Joe said. "He let me think. All this time, I thought you rode west and forgot me. I built 10,000 head of cattle out of thinking you forgot me. I built the whole half moon out of it." Elias sat back on his heels. And something changed in his face, and it was not relief, and she saw it change and did not understand it yet. "You thought I was a coward," he said slowly. "For 10 years. You thought I ran, Elias. No. It's fair. You had every cause. You waited, and nothing came, and you did what a strong woman does. You stopped waiting, and you built." He looked at the fire. "But Joe, look at what you built. Look at it. And look at me. I've got a saddle. That's the whole of it. That's what I rode back with. And now you'll open these and read them, and you'll know I meant every word. And it changes nothing, because there's still $8,000 on your ranch and a saddle's not going to pay it, and the whole county already thinks I came back with my hand out. They'll say it louder now. They'll say the drifter came home and worked his way into the rich woman's bed on a stack of old love letters. I don't care what the county says. You've cared your whole life what the county says. It's half of why you built so high." He stood. "I'll see the drive through. I gave you my word on the herd, and I'll keep it, storm or no. But when the cattle sell, Joe, I'll draw my $1 a day, and I'll ride on. You don't need saving. You never did. And I won't be the thing they point at when they explain how Joe Hartley finally slipped." He walked out past the firelight into the dark where the herd lay, and she let him go, because there was nothing she could say to a proud man's shame that his shame would let him hear. She held the 11 letters against her chest all night and did not open one. She wanted to open them with him. She had waited 10 years. She could wait to the railhead. The storm came the next afternoon. It came the way the old plains storms came, all at once and out of a clear enough morning, the bruise on the northwest sky rising up and up until it ate the sun, and the temperature dropped so fast a man's sweat turned cold on his neck between one breath and the next. The wind came first, then the white. Snow in the last week before the fall sale, weeks early. A freak and a killer. And it came sideways across 10,000 head strung out on a dry route with the nearest fence 40 miles gone. "They'll drift." Tom the foreman bawled it through the wind. "Joe, they'll turn tail to it and drift, and we'll lose the whole herd in the breaks. We can't hold 10,000 in this." And 10,000 head was $8,000 was the half moon was everything. Elias was already moving. He had his slicker on and his hat jammed down, and his horse turned into the white before Tom finished shouting, and Joe saw him ride into it. Into the wall of it. The man who'd said he would ride on, riding the wrong way, into the storm, toward the herd. Not away. Into it. Hold the point. He was roaring. "Turn 'em. Don't run 'em. We hold 'em against the creek bank. We bunch 'em tight, and we hold 'em through. Nobody freezes but the ones who quit. Ride." And the crew rode, because a man's voice in a storm is either a rope or a whip, and his was a rope, and 30 riders followed a penniless trail foreman into a blizzard to save another person's fortune. It went all night. They bunched the herd against the cutbank of the creek where the wind broke a little, and they rode the edges of it in the dark and the white, turning back the cattle that broke, singing to them, cursing them, driving them back into the mass where the animals' own bodies made a wall of heat that could keep the middle ones alive. A man lost the herd if he lost the edge, and a man lost the edge in that white in a heartbeat, and twice Joe heard cattle scream in the dark where the bank gave way and could do nothing. But the herd held. Hour on hour, the herd held. She lost track of Elias near midnight. She'd seen him on the far edge, the northwest edge, the killing edge, where the wind came hardest and the drifts built deepest, holding the point of the bunch alone because that was where a foreman put himself, and then the snow came down solid for a while, a whiteout inside the night, and when it thinned he was not there. His horse came in without him. She knew the horse. It came stumbling out of the white with its reins dragging, and its eyes rolled, and no man on it, and Joe Hartley did not think. She turned the gray into the northwest edge, into the worst of it, the way he'd gone, and she rode with her father's field glasses useless around her neck, and her own 2 eyes streaming, calling his name into a wind that took her voice and threw it away. She found him by the horse's track before the track filled. He was down in a drift at the bottom of a cut, where he'd gone over the bank turning a steer, horse and man, and the horse had scrambled up and left him, and he was on his side in the snow with the white already building a soft grave over his legs. Not moving much. Moving a little? A man freezes gentle at the end, they say. He goes warm and easy and glad to stop. No, she said. No, you don't. Not twice. You don't leave me twice, Elias Ward. She got down. She got a rope on him, and a rope on the horn, and she hauled. And she was a woman who'd wrestled bawling calves and green horses and a debt-choked ranch out of the dirt for 10 years. And she was strong, and she pulled him up out of that drift by main force with her own back and her own hands, the way she'd pulled everything else in her life up out of the ground. No man rescued her. She rescued him. She got him over his saddle when she caught his horse, and she walked them both back to the fire at the creek bank, leading 2 horses through the white, and she did not let him lie down until she had him by the fire and the cook was pouring hot coffee down him and the feeling was coming back into his hands in that way that hurts worse than the freezing did. He looked up at her through the steam, gray-faced, alive. You came into it, he said. That was fool's work. You could have died out there. For a hired man. For my foreman, she said. And you rode into it first. For my cattle. They're your cattle. Then we're even, she said. You saved what I built. I saved you. Nobody rescued anybody. We just held the line. Both of us. Same line. She crouched down in front of him. That's what I've been trying to tell you, you proud, stubborn, hard-headed man. I don't want to be rescued. I never did. I want somebody to hold the other end of the line. That's all it ever was. The storm blew itself out before dawn. The sun came up on a white plain and a bunched herd, cold and bawling and alive, near enough all of it. 40 head lost out of 10,000 where the bank gave way, which was a miracle, and the whole crew knew it was a miracle, and they knew whose voice had made it, and they looked at Elias Ward drinking coffee by the fire with a different set to their faces than they'd had at the drive start. They got the herd to the railhead 2 days later. 10,000 head. Or near enough. Fat off the West Trace water, unbroken by the storm, the best fall beef the county had seen in a drought year, and they sold at the top of the market because they were the only big herd that came through that early storm hole, and every other outfit that had run the dry route straight had scattered to the 4 winds, and the money that beef made was more than $8,000. The sale was in Harlan's Crossing at the courthouse on the day of the forced auction, and here is how it went. The whole county came. They came to watch the half moon go under the hammer, because that is what a county does, and they filled the square, and the Continental's clerk set up his table on the courthouse steps with the auction bills already printed, and Harmon Sloan stood beside the table in a fine gray coat with his thumbs in his vest and the look of a man about to be handed a river. Joe Hartley walked up the courthouse steps in her range clothes because she had not stopped to change, and she laid a bank draft on the clerk's plank table. $8,000, she said. The note in full. Count it. The square went quiet. The clerk looked at Sloane. Sloane's thumbs came out of his vest. "The auction is set," he said. The court has a note to be paid," said the lawyer at Joe's elbow, "and here is payment in full, tendered before the sale is called." "There is no auction, Mr. Sloane. There is a satisfied debt. Count the draft." The clerk counted it. He counted $8,000 onto the plank table in front of the whole crossing, and every bill he laid down was a bill the county had bet she couldn't raise, and Josephine Hartley stood over that table with cattle dust on her boots and did not smile, because she was not a woman who smiled at such things. She only watched it counted. "Paid," the clerk said, when it was done. "In full." And that should have been the end of Harmon Sloane. But it was not, because Elias Ward stepped up onto the courthouse steps then, hat in his hand, and he had papers of his own. "Before you fold up your table, Mr. Sloane," Elias said, "the county ought to see how the Continental came to hold that note in the first place." He laid the papers down. "That's the water claim filing your company made on the river bottom last spring," he said, "the one that gave you a lien to buy up. I rode to the county seat before the drive and pulled it. It's fraudulent. You filed a claim on running water you'd surveyed as still, on a bottom you swore under oath was unclaimed. And it wasn't unclaimed. It was already filed. By him." He nodded across the square. "And by him, and by 4 other men whose water you've been trying to squeeze out from under all year. Same trick, same forged survey. The neighboring ranchers were in that square. Sloane had squeezed every one of them. And they had come to watch Joe Hartley go under, half of them, in the small mean hope that a proud rich woman would be humbled. And instead they stood there and heard how the man who'd been bleeding all of them had done it, and one by one they turned and looked at Harmon Sloane, and one by one they stepped across the square and stood at Joe Hartley's side. It was the neighbors that broke him. Not the law. The neighbors. Sloane looked at the men closing ranks around the woman he'd been so sure would fold alone, and he understood that his company's name was about to be dragged through 6 lawsuits and a territorial fraud filing, and that a land speculator without a friendly rancher for 100 miles is a man with nothing to speculate on. He picked up his hat. "A woman alone," he said, mostly to himself, dry as the drought. "That's what I told the company. A woman alone will fold before the note comes due." He put the hat on. "I have never in my life been so thoroughly instructed." He rode out that afternoon, east, toward the railroad and whatever board would still have him, and the county watched him go, and nobody tipped a hat. Gideon Rowe came to her after, in the thinning crowd. He'd seen it all. He'd seen the draft counted, and the fraud laid bare, and, worst of all for a man in love, he'd seen her ride into a blizzard for a hired hand and come out the other side of it changed. He was a decent man, and decent men can read a plain thing when it's put in front of them. He took off his hat one last time. "You found the other end of your line, Joe," he said. "I always knew you would. I just kept hoping it'd be me holding it." He put out his hand, and he did not put it out to her. He put it out to Elias. "Ward, you held 10,000 head through a norther that scattered every other herd in the county. I'm on the bank board. If you ever want money to start your own place, you come to me, and I'll see you get a fair rate, and I'll shake your hand across the desk. That's all I've got to say." Elias shook it. "Obliged, Miss Rowe, but I don't believe I'll be starting my own place." "No," said Gideon, looking between the two of them. "No, I don't believe you will." And he put his hat back on, and he smiled a real smile that cost him something, and he walked away a free man. And he danced at a wedding a year later with a widow from Council Grove, and was happy, but that comes later. Joe turned to Elias in the square, with the county still thick around them, the same county that had whispered at the cattleman's supper, the same 40 cowhands and neighbors' men who'd carried his first name back to the crossing before the dust settled. And she did the thing in front of all of them that she'd been building towards since the morning she named him foreman. The half-moon's clear, she said, loud enough. Paid to the dollar. It's mine. Free, the way I built it. She looked at him. And I'm offering you half of it, Elias Ward. Half the land, half the herd, half the brand. Not as a wife to be kept. Not as a girl to be rescued. As a partner. Your name beside mine on the deed. Dollar for dollar. Work for work. The way we held that line. The county held its breath. Elias Ward looked at the woman who had outbuilt him and outlasted him and outpulled him, who had dragged him up out of a snowdrift with her own 2 hands and clearing $8,000 in the same week, and who was offering him not a rescue but a rope. The one thing his pride could take, the one thing that wasn't charity, because he'd earned every inch of it hand to hand. He'd come back with a saddle. He'd taken not $1 he hadn't worked for. And now she offered him a partnership he could look any man in the county in the eye and own. Partners, he said. And then, softer, so that only she and the front row of the astonished county heard it, he said the rest. And then, Joe, if a partner's allowed to ask, will you marry me? Not to save you. Not to keep you. Just because I've loved you since you were 17 and I finally rode back to say so, and it took 10 years and a locked box and a blizzard for you to hear it. Yes, she said, you fool. Yes. They were married on the half-moon porch 3 weeks later, and Gideon Rowe came, and the whole county came, and nobody whispered. But before the wedding, the evening after the sale, there was the porch at dusk. Joe and Elias stood by the door, with the crew's supper bell ringing down at the bunkhouse, and the light going gold and long across the range she'd built, and now would share. She had the 11 letters in her hand. She'd carried them from the drive unopened, all 11, the wax still whole, because she had waited 10 years and she would not open them alone. She put them into his hands. Read them to me, she said. All of them. From the beginning. He looked down at his own young hand on the paper. He broke the first seal. The oldest one, the one he'd written from Abilene a lifetime ago, a boy of 26 with holes in his boots and $8,000 of hope he never earned. He held it to the last of the light, and he read it aloud on the porch of the ranch she'd built out of believing he'd forgotten her, and it began. My dearest Joe, it is 140 miles to Abilene, and I have thought of you every one of them. And her hand found his arm, and held it, and the ghost that had walked between them for 10 years lay down at last and was quiet. He read all 11. It took until full dark. She lit the lamp, and he read on, and by the time he finished the last one, the moon was up over the half-moon, and the both of them were wrung out and easy, the way you are when a thing that's been clenched for a decade finally opens its hand. A year on, it was spring on the plains again. The half-moon ran its calves out on green grass, and the branding fire burned in the morning cool, and if you'd stood at the fence that spring, you'd have seen a thing the county had already gotten used to and stopped remarking on. 2 brands on every calf. The half-moon, the way it always was, and under it, small and neat, a single letter W. Elias worked the fire beside his wife. He drew a partner's share and a foreman's wage, and he had earned, by then, the right to draw either without a soul in 3 counties calling him a fortune hunter, because they'd all seen him ride into the storm and hold the line, and a county forgives a man anything once it's watched him nearly die for something that wasn't even his yet. The cottonwood colt sat on the mantel in the main house. Their mantel, now, it had a companion these days, a second little carving, a mare, that he'd whittled her the first winter so the colt wouldn't stand alone. The old iron strongbox sat in the corner of the study still, but the lock was gone off it. They kept seed corn in it. It seemed a good use for a box that had held so much dark for so long to hold, instead, the things you put in the ground and wait on and trust to come up green. The grandchildren of the very women who'd whispered at the cattleman's supper played tag in the half-moon yard on Sundays, and none of them knew a thing about any of it. Which is how you know a wound is truly healed, when the children play on the ground where it happened, and never feel a chill. They tended Amos Hartley's headstone. Jo saw to it herself. She'd forgiven her father, in the end, though it was a forgiveness with a price, the way the hardest ones are. She forgave him, and she never once pretended he'd been right. And she planted the sweetest grass on his grave and told him to his stone the thing he'd stolen 10 years to keep her from saying that she'd married the drifter. And the drifter had held 10,000 head through a norther and saved the ranch her father nearly married her off to save, and Amos could make of that what a dead man makes of anything. Word came, once, secondhand, about Harmon Sloan. A cattle buyer passing through said he'd seen the man 3 counties over, selling shares in a railroad spur that hadn't been built, and folks were starting to think, never would be. A woman alone, he'd said. He'd learned better, and it hadn't done him a bit of good. And on the porch in the evenings, when the work was done and the light went gold, Jo and Elias Ward sat in 2 chairs that matched, and they watched the range that carried both their names, and sometimes she'd reach over without a word, and he'd take her hand, and they'd hold on, one at each end. Because some fortunes are built to be carried alone, and some are built to be shared. And the heart, whatever your father tells you, and whatever the county whispers, and whatever 10 hard years try to teach you, the heart keeps no clock at all. If you've ever waited on someone, or wished you had, tell me your city. Wherever you're listening from, I'd like to know who's out there.